The theme of our thesis is the influence of psychological acceptance and internalizing problems, university students upon smartphone addiction tendency, the moderated mediating effects of adverse childhood experiences. The table of contents is as follows. First, this is an introduction to this study. As a smartphone is universalized and comes to be more diverse in function due to the rapid development in IT technology, the smartphone is proceeding with expanding its influence upon the life of modern people around the world. Especially as a result of what the Pew Research, as a U.S. market research company surveyed, the percentage of smartphone usage targeting 27 countries in the world, our country's smartphone penetration rate appeared to be 95%. The smartphone distribution rate was indicated to be the highest among the surveyed nations. The smartphone based on high speed and portability not only offers new environments and increased social communication using the collaborative participation and the collective intelligence, but also provided an opportunity available for enjoying entertainment or leisure through various applications. Thanks to convenience and accessibility in this way, the smartphone became the existence in disability to us. However, similarly like a coin of having two sides, there are both upside and downside together, even in the use of smartphone. The excessive use of smartphone may bring about addiction-related problems as well as physical discomforts such as turtleneck, amblyopia, and sleep disorder. As the smartphone addiction is the condition of being unable to control smartphone usage on its own, it implies what the excessive use of smartphone leads to the occurrence in the danger of everyday life or in the conflicts with own neighbors and in the healthy problem. Particularly in case of university students, they are in the period of corresponding to early adulthood of leading to becoming psychologically independent from their parents, thereby coming to be recognized their autonomy by their parents, resulting in coming to be more free to use smartphone than adolescents and in being more likely to be immersed in smartphone. Accordingly, the approach is needed for encouraging the sound use of smartphone and for reducing the side effects of pathological use. People who have a problem related to addiction mostly have irrational beliefs or ideas, thereby showing vulnerability psychologically. An interest is recently rising in ACT of helping it escape its influence through making it experience that a thought or emotion is just an idea and feeling, but is not what it really is, with accepting the cognitive process itself that is difficult to be changed. As ACT is the treatment based on acceptance and awareness, it is one method of psychotherapy that makes it find and realize the true value of life through this. In particular, as the psychological acceptance implies what experience and accepts as it is without avoiding the present moment, it leads to moving in a constructive direction so that the behavior can be helpful for oneself with regarding all experience as valuable. Yet the low psychological acceptance level leads to the insufficient ability of possible tolerating own emotion or thinking and to evading this, resulting in coming to experience the difficulty in emotional regulation and further to suffer the internalizing problems like depression, anxiety, or contraction. This internalizing problem can function not only as the outcome variable of psychological acceptance, but also as a listen variable of smartphone addiction tendency. As the internalizing problem is a part related to the passive and socially stunted behavior and to the negative emotional like depression or anxiety, it leads to experiencing a difficulty in managing daily life with being adjusted to reality. Examining the aspect in relation to social withdrawal that is one of the internalizing problems, the case of having difficulty in forming relationship and exchanging with other people amidst society to which oneself belongs, leads to inordinately using the online space in order to meet a desire for the unsatisfied relationship in reality while coming to be isolated socially. Meanwhile, according to the attachment and trauma theory, it was mentioned that the problematic behavior of being shown in adulthood is associated with the negative experience of having been undergone within family relations during childhood, and that the adverse childhood experience made it difficult for healthy psychological growth with going through the developmental stage after this, and made it apt to show negative image in diverse aspects such as a dysfunctional emotional regulation strategy or the absorption in addictive behavior. The expression of tendency which tries to evade problematic situations or feelings even after becoming an adult in order to escape from the adverse childhood experience lead to lowering a psychological acceptance level and posing a serious threat to an individual's basic sense of stability, resulting in being accompanied by the negative emotion like psychological instability, depression, or anxiety. Furthermore, what fails to be socially supported and forms negative self-image due to a difficulty in interpersonal relationship leads to the high tendency of being addicted to online space, of thinking that oneself has a sense of control, has power, and can experience safety as a plane for deserving this. In the research by Young-ok and An Dong-hyun, it was claimed that the adverse childhood experience comes to be left after effects like depression, anxiety, or social withdrawal, with becoming adulthood after this. And in the research by Kang In-kyung and Kim Choonkyung, the research outcome was shown as saying that the more experience in child abuse from parents leads to the higher smartphone addiction level. Overall, it can be predicted that the psychological acceptance in undergraduates may have influence upon smartphone addiction tendency mediated by internalizing problems, and that the adverse childhood experiences may function as a moderating variable in the process, that the psychological acceptance affects internalizing problems. Hence, this study is aimed to inspect a model with the combination of a mediation model and a moderation model based on the model of verifying a moderated mediating effect. Based on this study established the research problems that what about a moderated mediating effect of the adverse childhood experience in the influence of undergraduates' psychological acceptance upon smartphone addiction tendency through internalizing problems. Next, the study method is explained. To conduct this study, a questionnaire survey was carried out targeting students who are attending universities where are located in Daegu and Gyeongbu. The socio-demographic characteristics of the research subjects are the same as those in the table, so please refer to the table. In this study, 4 measurement tools were used. First, to gauge psychological acceptance, the Korean Acceptance Action Questionnaire 2 was used that Heo Jae-hong, Choi Myung-sik, and Jin Hyun-jang adapted the Acceptance Action Questionnaire developed by Hayes. It implies that the higher score leads to the higher psychological acceptance level. Second, to gauge internalizing problems, this study used NEO2 personality tests that An Hyun-ui and An Chang-gyu standardized Big 5 personality scale, which was developed by Costa and McCrae. The research analysis was applied the standardized T-score, and it implies that the higher average value leads to the higher internalizing problems. Third, to survey smartphone addiction tendency, smartphone addiction scale based on behavior addiction criteria was used that Lee Jong-hwan developed. Sub-factors of this scale comprise salience, conflict, mood regulation, tolerance, withdrawal, and recurrence. It means that the higher score leads to the higher smartphone addiction tendency. Fourth, to gauge adverse childhood experience, ACE scale was used that was developed by Center for Kaiser Control and Prevention in San Diego of California in the United States based on conflict tactics scale by Strauss and on the childhood trauma questionnaire by Bernstein. It implies that the higher total score leads to the higher adverse childhood experience level. The detailed data analysis method is as follows. First, to examine correlation between variables, Pearson's correlation analysis was carried out. Second, to prove the moderated mediating effect, process macro was applied, as this is what analyzed through combining the result of a mediating effect and a moderating effect. This study was estimated the influence of the psychological acceptance according to the adverse childhood experience level upon smartphone addiction tendency mediated by internalizing problems. In addition, to look into a size of a mediating effect that is varied depending on the moderating variables, the statistical significance of a conditional indirect effect was inspected with a bootstrapping method. This is the research result. As a result of prisming the skewness and kurtosis of the undergraduate psychological acceptance, internalizing problems, smartphone addiction tendency, and adverse childhood experiences. Ahead of examining a correlation among main variables, it was shown that the absolute value of standard skewness index is under 3 and that the absolute value of standard kurtosis index is less than 10 in terms of measurement variables. Thus, the skewness and kurtosis of measurement variables in this study can be seen to satisfy the normal distribution assumption. As a result of figuring out a correlation among undergraduates' psychological acceptance, internalizing problems, smartphone addiction tendency, and adverse childhood experiences, based on this, the significant correlation among all variables was shown. Examining concretely, the psychological acceptance reflected a negative correlation with internalizing problems, smartphone addiction tendency, and adverse childhood experiences. The internalizing problems showed a positive correlation with smartphone addiction tendency and adverse childhood experiences. the smartphone addiction tendency appeared to express a positive correlation with adverse childhood experiences. Next, moderated mediating effects of the adverse childhood experiences. To prove whether a mediating effect that the psychological acceptance influenced the smartphone addiction tendency after passing through the internalizing problems is varied depending on the adverse childhood experience level as a moderating variable. It used model number 7 of process macro designated 5,000 times of bootstrapping and established the confidence interval of 95%. The outcomes of the moderated mediating effects of the adverse childhood experience are as Table 1. As a result, the influence of psychological acceptance upon smartphone addiction tendency mediated by internalizing problems is meant to get weaker in the higher adverse childhood experience level. To confirm the significant interaction pattern between psychological acceptance and adverse childhood experiences, each of the average variation was examined by dividing the adverse childhood experience as a moderated parameter into low group, middle group, and high group. Resultingly, it was shown that the higher adverse childhood experience level leads to the lower reduction rate in the internalizing problematic behavior according to an increase in psychological acceptance. This is the discussion and conclusion of this study. The discussion according to the result of this study are as follows. The adverse childhood experiences appeared to have a significant moderated mediating effect in the process, that the undergraduate's psychological acceptance has influence upon smartphone addiction tendency after undergoing the internalizing problems. In other words, the mediating effect of internalizing problems was shown to be varied depending on the adverse childhood experience level in the influence of psychological acceptance upon smartphone addiction tendency. Concretely, examining through the conditional indirect effect, this can be known that the higher psychological acceptance leads to the lower smartphone addiction tendency mediated by internalizing problems, but that the higher adverse childhood experience level at this time leads to possibly reducing the negative influence of psychological acceptance upon smartphone addiction tendency mediated by internalizing problems. Accordingly, a program or activity is important for reducing the internalizing problems in the aspect for preventing smartphone addiction in undergraduates. However, there is a need to examine together about not only the individual aspects but also the family environment aspect in relation to smartphone addiction by considering what a difference is shown in the influence among variables depending on the adverse childhood experiences. That is to say, the necessity is seen that will conduct the parent education targeting the infancy of all childhood parents in the preventive dimension by considering a point that the negative experience suffered within a family relation during childhood can become a major cause for problematic behavior even in adolescence and adulthood after this. Moreover, there is a difference in the influence depending on the adverse childhood experiences, yet the psychological acceptance appears to be a factor of decreasing smartphone addiction tendency. Thus, there is a need to develop and apply a program available for making it capable of coping well with a situation by using the energy of having been consumed for avoidance in a place of experiencing other productive, active, or positive emotion through realizing and accepting own cognitive and emotional parts, literally with using a psychological coping strategy called acceptance instead of evading the experience. Based on these findings, the significances of this study are as follows. First, this study was examined the psychological acceptance and the internalizing problems as the variables of affecting university students' smartphone addiction tendency, as the psychological acceptance is one of the main concepts in ACT, that is the third generation of cognitive behavioral therapy. It is a concept related to the cognitive aspect. Hence, there is a significance in a regard of being available for suggesting a specific problem which can diminish smartphone addiction tendency through inquiring into the influence upon smartphone addiction tendency in the cognitive characteristic, the both psychological acceptance and the emotional future called internalizing problems. Second, this study was checked the mediating effect moderated by adverse childhood experiences, thereby having confirmed that the mediating effect of internalizing problems can be regulated depending on the adverse childhood experience level in the influence of university students' psychological acceptance upon smartphone addiction tendency. Undergraduates are in the process of achieving independence psychologically and economically. But considering a point that the negative experience of being suffered in a relationship with parents in childhood may deteriorate the quality of life in adulthood after this. The adverse childhood experiences can be a crucial factor for university students' smartphone addiction tendency. This is suggesting the necessity of supporting the parent education so that not only an individual but also a family can attentively prevent the adverse childhood experiences in order to decrease undergraduates' smartphone addiction tendency. Despite this significance, the following are the limitations of this study and the suggestion for future research. First, there is difficulty in generalizing the findings in that this study was carried out the research analysis targeting undergraduates at university were located in Daegu and Gyeongbu. Accordingly, a further research needs to be progressed, a generalized study available for reducing university students' smartphone addiction tendency by conducting a survey targeting undergraduates all over the country. Second, this study was verifying causality among variables of affecting smartphone addiction tendency. However, in light of the finding as saying that the smartphone addiction tendency is shown the higher average score in women than in men, a follow-up research needs to inquire into a difference in verification of causality depending on gender. Moreover, there will be a great significance as basic data for a later research given trying to inspect even the game addiction tendency together, including smartphone. Thank you for your attention.